McCann Troll, Part 2. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor, examining the conduct and behaviours of Brenda Leyland, an individual who was accused of trolling the parents of Madeline McCann, the young girl who went missing some years ago. The information is being provided in an interview by her son, which provides many indicators of narcissistic behaviour. In 2008, Ben moved to the United States. He'd found life in Burton Overy claustrophobic. Only 370 people lived there. The post office had closed due to lack of demand, and there was just one pub. Ben couldn't cope with the idea that he was responsible for his mother's happiness. The only person she said she cared about was me, he says. It was too much pressure. He told himself he was leaving England to escape his debts and Brenda. It would appear that she had allocated him the position of non-intimate partner primary source within her fuel matrix. But in the United States, he only entrapped himself further. In 2009, he met a French woman and they wed 2 years later. The pressure of the sham marriage and Brenda's increasing demands, hoovering, lack of emotional empathy, sense of entitlement, took their toll. After I got married, Mum pulled me to one side as she got into the taxi to go to the airport and said she had 3 months to live. Ben says it wasn't true. It was just the attention was on me and my then wife and she couldn't handle it. Threat to control, absence of fuel, creation of pity play, nullification of threat to control, lack of accountability for behaviour. Ben was unhappily married, closeted and living a white picket fence life that was a lie. Both he and Brenda were struggling in private with their identities. By 2013, Ben and his wife had separated, and in 2014 they divorced. In her final decade, Brenda went on trips to India, Africa and the Middle East. She loved to travel and would go on her own. Did she have relationships after the divorce? She met this much older guy when walking her dog, who she claimed was the owner of Steinway, the piano maker. Was that true? I met the guy, he seemed suave and sophisticated. I don't know what the owner of Steinway was doing living in Leicester. He shrugs and smiles. Likely lie, delusion. About 3 years before she died, Brenda spent a low-key Christmas with Ben and his wife in Washington, D.C. They played Monopoly, ate pork loin, and did nothing noteworthy. A few days later, after Brenda had returned to England, she accidentally forwarded him an email she had sent to her brother about her Christmas. She described how on 26th of December, when she was with us at home, we were in Langley, Virginia, at a soiree with heads of state diplomats and the head of the CIA. Delusion, fantasy, triangulation, revision of history. Ben might have suspected Brenda had made stuff up before, but now he was sure. For the first time, he challenged her. He said, "No, we were eating pork, playing Monopoly, and I think you were losing. We had to go 3 or 4 rounds before getting anywhere near the truth." I said, "What the hell was that story about?" In the end, she said, "I was probably drunk and your uncle was giving me a hard time about coming out to see you so often, and I wanted her to think that I was having an incredible time." He thinks his mother was ashamed of the emptiness of her own life and created an alternative reality for herself. Ben began to realise his mother was a mythomaniac. Mythomania is somebody who has a condition whereby they lie or exaggerate to a normal degree. Those of you listening will, of course, be much more aware that such behaviours are applicable to narcissists. Revising the truth, being grandiose, being deluded. But of course, in this instance, Ben isn't able to realise that this is what's really going on. He, understandably, but incorrectly, believes that she's ashamed of the emptiness of her own life. In actual fact, she doesn't experience that shame, but her narcissism causes her to create an alternative reality, which causes her to lie in the way that she did in order to portray an alternative lifestyle so that it enables her to control people and causes them to respond in a particular way. The article continues. After this, there were other times when Ben confronted her about lying, challenge Fuel. We'd have arguments that reached boiling point, ignition of fury, then we wouldn't talk for months at a time, assertion of control by staying in a position of withdrawal. It definitely got more heated between us in the final years. Heated fury, repeated threats to control. But Ben was having his own problems with the truth. I was in a marriage that was window dressing, and my wife didn't know about my cocaine habit. I had my own shit going on. When they spoke on the phone, Brenda invariably updated him on Madeline and her latest theories about the McCanns. After Madeline's disappearance, Kate and Jerry McCann admitted that they had left their 3 children alone in the apartment in Praia da Luz, Portugal, when they went to eat with friends. Along with many other conspiracy theorists, Brenda was convinced that they were responsible for Madeline's abduction, as a result of negligence or worse. Ben admits that he barely listened while she rattled on. At least he thought. It kept her occupied. On the 30th of September 2014, Ben received a phone call from Brenda. She sounded panicked in a way he'd not heard before. She told him that earlier in the day she had been questioned by a TV journalist about the McCanns. Ben didn't know what she meant. Mum said, "I'm in trouble." I was like, "What's going on?" She told him that her Twitter handle was @Sweepyface, named after Sweep, her first boxer dog, and he visited the account where she'd been writing about the McCanns. He discovered that her avatar was a photograph of his boxer dog, and she had recorded her address as Los Angeles. When I saw that, I was like, "Are you kidding me?" Then I started reading through her Twitter account, and I was like, holy shit. There were hundreds of messages about Madeline and the McCanns. They were vitriolic and potentially libelous. Ben knew his mother had the capacity to rage, ignition of fury, and that she had strong opinions about the McCanns' sense of entitlement, but he'd never seen anything like this. Tweets included #McCann, question, how long must the McCanns suffer? Answer, for the rest of their miserable lives. Lack of emotional empathy, provocation. I think Kate #McCann sees herself as a modern-day Eva Peron, beautiful suffering instead of a booze-filled nymphomaniac. Smearing, provocation, absence of emotional empathy. Hate, a powerful emotion. It is a compliment to Maddie that we hate her parents who betrayed her. You can move to France anywhere, but social media is everywhere. Our memories are long. To Kate and Jerry, you will be hated by millions for the rest of your miserable, evil, conniving lives. Have a nice day. Provocation, insult, smearing, assertion of control, drawing of fuel. How did Ben react when he saw the tweets? My initial reaction was crisis management, he says, damage limitation. I was working in law at that time, and I thought, there's a story that's going to come out. We have very little time to deal with it. I have to jump into action mode. He admits that he also took a perverse pleasure in her situation. There was this part of me that was like, for years, I've put up with never having been good enough for you. Also, lack of control environment for him, devaluing behaviour. Always being told, you don't love me, devaluing behaviour, lack of emotional empathy. And finally, you fucked up. The tables were turned. So some of it was schadenfreude. I felt vindicated that she was coming to me cap in hand, but I also felt now it's my responsibility to make this go away. Even then, he says, he had no sense it would all end tragically. Yes, she had sent a load of nasty tweets and engaged with a community of conspiracy theorists who fed off each other. Fuel. But then, back then, we didn't really understand the impact of the internet. After all, it was only virtual reality. It was a different era, he says. This idea that a single person could be completely cancelled didn't really exist at that time. So when I saw this stuff on Sky News, I thought this is not good, but I didn't have any awareness of the full extent of its impact. Ben advised Brenda not to invite the Sky News reporter Martin Brunt into the home and to say nothing. But he found out at the inquest that she had already spoken to him for half an hour in her home, albeit off camera. She was more helpless than I'd ever seen her before, he says. Was she panicked because she realised she'd done something wrong, or because she'd been found out? I think she'd had time to reflect that she'd gotten a little bit carried away. That's what she said in her final email. Did she have any sense of the pain that the tweets might have caused the McCanns? It's difficult to say. I think she lost sight of their humanity, and they were just the target of the investigation. Objectification, absence of emotional empathy. He uses the word investigation deliberately. Ben was later to discover that Brenda didn't think of herself as a troll, but as a journalist investigating the McCann's grandiosity. In her last will and testament, she said her job title was investigative journalist. That was the role she had assumed, he says. Had she ever done any journalism? No. Grandiosity, delusion. Ben's attempts at crisis management were in vain. A couple of days later, the story broke on Sky. When he called Brenda, it just went to voicemail. By this time, he was really worried. He was talking to his brother, whom he hadn't spoken to for years after they drifted apart. I said to my brother, "Do you think there's a chance she might try to take her life?" And he said, "Well, it wouldn't be without precedent." Ben hadn't known she'd attempted suicide before. Attempted suicide. Pity play. He started to fear the worst. I'd entertained suicide many times, and I knew I was cut from the same cloth as Mum. A couple of days passed without any contact. A friend told him he needed to get out of the house, so he drove to a beach he had visited with Brenda a couple of years earlier. It was early morning, and he was already drinking white wine when his iPad lit up with a FaceTime call from her. He answered it, but there was nobody there. He called back, and it went straight to voicemail. Nevertheless, he was relieved. I was like, she sent up a flare. She doesn't want to talk, but she wants me to know everything's okay. I had another couple of glasses of wine and thought, thank God. Hoover. Assertion of control, nullification of threat to control by not answering. A few minutes later, his father called and told him that Brenda had fatally overdosed in a hotel 15 miles from home. He refused to believe it. I said, that doesn't make any sense. She's just called. He now thinks that the police at the scene accidentally rang him. Ben was broken. For all their fallouts, he and Brenda had been umbilically linked. Extension of self. He worked for a few more months, but his addictions were getting out of hand. He was drinking whiskey with his morning coffee, going to the toilet to take cocaine. It soon became unsustainable. He had to choose between his addictions and work, so he quit work. He told himself he was a hedonist, but he knew he was just destroying himself. He says he has no right to be alive today. It was only at the inquest in March 2015, 5 months after her death, that he began to fully understand his mother's life. Consultant psychiatrist Dr. Chris Zakrzewski said he had treated Brenda throughout the 1990s and that she had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and depression. See my observations about diagnoses of borderline personality disorder in the video, The Borderline. Dr. Zakrzewski recorded that she had twice been admitted to psychiatric hospitals in the 1990s when her depression was severely exacerbated. He said there had been suicidal attempts or gestures, pity plays. But her religion and intense love of children were regarded as suicide risk limiting factors. She was a deeply, sometimes morbidly reflective thinker, often getting despondent over the way the world is, pity plays, and particularly angry and despondent over real or perceived mistreatment of children, both her own and others. Apparent saviour complex, of course, with regard to Madeline McCann. Dr. Zakrzewski said he lost contact with Brenda in the early 2000s when she had trouble funding her treatment. Mrs. Leyland was an extremely intelligent and proud woman with a streak of mistrustfulness, paranoia, in her complex though vulnerable personality, time and again giving way to clinical depression. Overall, the risk of serious harm was there. It can, of course, be the case that narcissism will sit alongside somebody's narcissism and have an impact upon them. Sky News said at the inquest that it authorised Brunt to doorstep Brenda as it was in the public interest to challenge her about trolling the McCanns due to the growing debate about the lack of control of social media, and because courts were now handing jail sentences to trolls. It believed its investigation would have been frustrated if she'd been forewarned. Sky decided to show Brenda's face in the report, but named her only by her Twitter handle to limit the risk of online abuse by others. Brunt, a hugely experienced reporter, was described by his employer as a sensitive journalist and a man of integrity. One reason he chose Brenda rather than the other McCann trolls was because she couldn't be identified by her Twitter handle. He said she was self-assured and seemed quite confident. Brunt told the inquest that on her return from the garden centre, she invited him into her home. I sat down and said something like, "Sorry to have ruined your day." Mrs. Leyland said something like, "I don't know yet whether you've ruined my day or my life." He asked Brenda to do a more considered interview on camera. She declined, but he said she told him, "I just want the McCanns to answer questions, sense of entitlement, assertion of control. It's about how they left their children, and I don't believe their story. She also said she hoped that she hadn't broken the law and she had honestly thought tweeting was a vehicle by which you could express things. At the inquest, Brunt said he told her the report would appear on Sky News. She said, "I don't get that." I said something like, "Well, it may be uncomfortable for a day, but these things tend to blow over." I was trying to make her feel less bad about it because I do understand the enormity of being exposed on television. Brunt said Brenda had been very pleasant and that there had been nothing about her demeanour or anything she said that had caused me concern. The following day, Brenda called Brunt, Hoover, and asked if they could blur her face, nullification of threat to control. He told her that wasn't his call. He told her the report would be broadcast the following day. I think I said, "I hope it isn't too grim," meaning for her, Brunt said at the inquest, and she said, "Well, I'll go out for the day. I was thinking of ending it all, but I've had a glass of wine and I'm feeling better now." The last thing she said to me was that it had been nice meeting me. After that, I had no further contact with Brenda Leyland. Brunt said he did think the comment about ending it all was a reference to suicide, but he regarded it as a throwaway remark and believed that there was no risk of her taking her life. 2 days after the report was broadcast, Brenda was found dead in a hotel room. Brunt told the inquest at Leicester Town Hall, "I recognise that my feelings are of little importance compared with those of Mrs. Leyland's family, but I wish to put on record that I was and still am devastated by Mrs. Leyland's death." He said he took his journalistic responsibilities seriously and was not cavalier in his pursuit of stories, but acknowledged that two facts were inescapably linked. "I exposed Mrs. Leyland, and 2 days later she was dead. Her death is a haunting reminder that anything we do as journalists can lead to consequences, big or small, and in this case tragic. The enormity of what happened will always be with me." 2 weeks after Brenda took her own life, the then Justice Secretary Chris Grayling quadrupled the maximum custodial sentence for trolling to 2 years. Grayling said these internet trolls are cowards who are poisoning our national life. No one would permit such venom in person, so there should be no place for it on social media. The abuse of the McCanns was an early example of armchair detectives and conspiracy theorists swarming around a new story. See also the dangers of snapshotting in relation to the recent death of Nicola Bulley. It had heralded a new era of trolling that has now become all too familiar. There had been a dramatic rise in the number of trolls jailed by the time Brenda died. In 2014, 1,209 people were found guilty of offences under Section 127 of the Communications Act 2003, compared with 143 in 2004. Most are believed to be trolls abusing social media platforms. Last month, the family of Nicola Bulley, whose body was pulled out of the River Wyre in Lancashire 3 weeks after she went missing in January, were repeatedly savaged on social media. In the 9 years since Brenda died, social media companies have done little to clamp down on people using their platforms to defame and abuse individuals. Brenda Leyland spent her life hiding by making things up, delusion, and concealing herself behind fake names and avatars, nullification of threat to control. After she died, Ben examined her Twitter account closely. There were friends in the McCann trolling community who grieved her passing, but by and large, after she was exposed, people on social media were cruel and unforgiving. In her final days, the troll was trolled mercilessly. On Twitter, people said things like, "I hope you beg for mercy. I hope you get gang raped orally, anally and vaginally," Ben says. They photoshopped pictures of her to make her look like she had fangs and was a zombie, with blood pouring out of her. As Brenda had forgotten about the McCann's humanity, well, she never believed in it in the first place because she had no emotional empathy, so her critics forgot about hers. Ben believes in her final hours she would have read some of those tweets. 9 years on, he no longer blames the Sky News expose for his mother's death. It was inevitable that at some point she would be exposed for one thing or another, he says. There were so many things she was ashamed of that she never addressed: her mental health problems, her mythomania, her anger, her lack of purpose. That's what killed my mum, Ben says. It was encrusted layers of shame over the years that made it impossible for her to do more than allude to stuff that she had to deal with. Her inability to say, "I need help." Her inability to say, "I'm not okay." As for Twitter, Ben says that's merely a platform. The problem isn't what these trolls are saying, or that these trolls are nasty people who have nothing else in their life but to sit in a basement being awful. The question is, why are they like that? What has happened that has created people who are only able to find joy in venting their spleen and displaying their resentments in this way? He talks about how many people feel alienated from society, the number living in poverty, the paucity of mental health support. If you treat the symptom, you never get to the heart of the problem. The problem is, why are people so angry and afraid? Most importantly, Ben believes Brenda's death taught him how to live. He began to realise that if he was going to survive, he would have to overcome the shame that he was suffocating him. So he finally came out and owned his addictions. In fact, he has become obsessively truthful. For the past few years, he's been writing about his life and his mother's. There is not a taboo, indignity or humiliation he doesn't expose, whether it's experimenting with his mother's vibrator, dressing in her clothes, or a compulsion to shit in the garden. He is on a one-man mission to root out shame from our existence. It's particularly important today, he says, when we live in a world whose mobs pile on indiscretions, unpopular opinions and poorly chosen words. Ben has managed to turn his life around, and as a life coach is now helping others to do the same. He only wishes Brenda could have done the same. Our stories run in parallel in so many ways, he says. I'm glad there was a fork in the road and I didn't end up doing what she did, because there were times when it could have been very easily ended that way. We've been talking on Zoom for about 3 hours. Ben says he wants to make one thing very clear. He doesn't want to dishonour his mother, because at the end of the day I fucking love my mum, I miss her, and I pretty much do anything to bring her back. This is the worst thing that ever happened to me, and it's damn near destroyed me. But if there's something positive come out of this, it's the experience I've had of completely unburdening myself of my shames and my secrets and my pain. And finding out that if you do that, not only are you going to be okay, but you can help other people get better too. One thing, of course, that Ben has failed to realise, has failed to gain understanding of, is the fact that his mother was in all likelihood a narcissist as a consequence of the various repeated indicators that demonstrate that she acted with a sense of entitlement, an absence of emotional empathy for people, a lack of accountability for her behaviours, haughtiness, grandiosity, magical thinking, various types of manipulation that she utilised, poor boundary recognition, and many different aspects of the narcissistic dynamic. He hasn't realised this, nor have others, but it is as plain as can be seen. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.